Welcome to this week's Halacha Shir. It's entitled Nichum Avelim, the do's and don'ts of a Shiva visit. We always find a topic which is connected to the coming week's Sedra, and this is no exception. This week's Sedra, Sarah Imenu dies, Avram Avinu dies. The Pasuk says, Vatoma Sarah Bekiras Arba Hichevrein, Beretz Knoan, Vayovay Avraham Lispeid Lesarah V'Livkaisa. And then later in the parsha, Vayigva Vayomas Avram B'Seva Tov Zokin, etc. And the pasuk then says, "Vahi acharei mois Avram vayivarech lekimes Yitzchak b'noi." And Rashi tells us, "Nichmei tanchumei avelim." So, as it were, this is the first Shiva visit in Torah. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is coming to be Menachem Yitzchak on the loss of his father, and we have, of course, the death of Sarah earlier in the parsha. So it's a good opportunity to talk about this, and please God, it should only be in theory and not in practice. We should only have simchas in Hashem. The first question is, what is the status of Nichum Avelim? When a person goes to visit somebody sitting Shiva, is that a mitzvah deraisa? Is it a mitzvah drabanan? Is it a minhag tov? Well, what actually is it? So the Rabbeinu Yoina says, this is in Brachas Yudalef on the base, Bedafe Harif. He says the following: if you're listening online, please email me at j.golker@gmail.com. I'll send you the handout. Tanchumi Avelim midoraisa. The Rabbeinu Yoina is of the opinion that a Shiva visit is a mitzvah min ha-Torah, to bichlal gemilas chasodim hava, because it's part of the broader sort of umbrella of gemilas chasodim. For gemilas chasodim min ha-Torah kadomin v'edat lohem es haderech zu gemilas chasodim. So the Rabbeinu Yoina is of the opinion that Nichum Avelim is actually min ha-Torah. The Rambam, however, argues and says it's a mitzvah drabanan. This is in Hilchos Avul Perek Yudalet Halacha Aleph, and famously the Rambam says that all the things that we're very familiar with in terms of hachmasas kala, hitzos etc., are all mitzvahs drabanan. This is his lashon. Mitzvahs aseh shal divreihem levaker chaylim. There is a mitzvah aseh midivreihem midrabanan to visit chaylim, ulenachim avelim, to pay a shiva visit, to comfort the mourners, lahitzi hameis, to take out the mace, for lahachnis hakala, to lahachnis kala is we'll see is different to simchas chosin v'kala. That presumably means to actually facilitate the wedding, in other words, to help pay for the expenses and to somehow, maybe shidduchim, to bring her to that point. The laves ha'archim, to accompany guests. We've had shiurim on all of these topics, I think, or many of these topics. V'lisasik b'chol tzarchei hakvura, and then to be involved in all aspects of the kvura, loses ala kosev, to carry the coffin on the shoulder, v'leilech lefonov v'lisbei v'lachbar v'likbar, to give a hesped, to dig the grave, to fill it, v'chein lesameach hakala v'hachosan, and simchas kala v'chosan is also a mitzvah drabanan according to the Rambam, v'lesadom b'chol tzorcheihem, and to help them, v'eilu hein gemilas chasodim shebegufe she'ein loim shia. Now, even though, and then the Rambam carries on, even though they are mitzvahs midrabanan, nevertheless they're sort of under the wider category of after rechel kamecha. That's what the Rambam says. So Nichum Avelim deraisa drabanan, it's a machlekes rishonim. The Rabbeinu Yoina holds it's a deraisa. The Rambam says it's a drabanan. What's notable, just before we get into some do's and don'ts, is the Rambam seems to change the order from the order that appears in our Siddur that we say every single morning. We say Eilu Dvarim, and Eilu Dvarim is based on a brisa in Shabbos Kuf Chav Zayin Amud Aleph. The Gemara says that if you look at paragraph 3, it says Eilu Dvarim she'adam eichel parasein be'el mazeh va'keren kayemes le'olam haba. That these are the things that we eat, the fruits of them in this world, but the main reward is in Olam haba. Ve'elu hein kibud aveim gemilas chasodim hashkomas beis hamedrash shachar za'arvis hachnosos orchim bikochelim hachnosos kala havayis amesi and tefillah v'avashem edem chaver v'talmud Torah keneged kulam. That's what we're very familiar with. Interestingly, the Rambam changes the order. His nusach is levaker chaylim lenachem avelim elotzi ames v'lachnis kala. He's got a slightly different order. It's very interesting to understand why the Rambam changed the order. Something to sort of think about. It could be that you could argue that he's going in a sort of a chronological order. The first thing is Bikr Chaylim, and then Rachman al-Islam, if the Chaylim doesn't get better and passes away, then it's Nichum Avelim. That doesn't quite work because Lahitzi Ames comes afterwards. Maybe that the Nichum Avelim can apply even before the Levaya. Maybe, and we're not talking about the actual Shiva, which of course starts afterwards. But either way, there's discussion why the Rambam changes the order somewhat. There is also a very famous Maisa that's worth mentioning if we've mentioned the Brisa, that on the Brisa, which appears on Shabbos Kuf Chav Zayin Amud Aleph, and the same Nusach appears in our Siddur, the order is later on, Biku Chaylim, Hachnosas Kala, or Levayas Hames, which seems to be a strange order, because you have Bikur Cholim, the natural progression, I guess logically would be Levayas Hames afterwards, but yet Hachnosas Kala is put in between. There's a famous Maisa that Reb Chaim Kreisworth was once diagnosed with a very serious illness, and he went to get a bracha from the stipler, and the stipler told him he should get involved in Hachnosas Kala. He should collect money to help people who couldn't afford to make weddings. And he did that, and indeed, the Reb Chaim Kreisworth, I think he lived for about 20 years since that diagnosis. And the stipler explained to him this exact point. He says that the order should be Bikur Cholim or Levayas Hames, but for some reason Hachnosas Kala is put in between. And the stipler said to him, there seems to be a sugula, that if you get involved in Hachnosas Kala, that will be a break, a barrier between Bikur Cholim and Levayas Hames, which indeed was the case for Rabbi Kreisworth. It did indeed give him, Baruch Hashem, 20 years, one of the greats of the last generation. Okay, let's press on. So a few do's and don'ts of visiting a Shiva house. The first is a well-known halacha, and that is one has to wait for the ovel, for the mourner, to talk first. It's an open halacha in Shulchan Aruch. This is in Yerodeh, Siman Shin Ayin Vav Sif Aleph. Ein hamanachamim rishoyim liftayach at sheyiftach ha'ovel tchila. That the menachamim, those who are comforting, those who are coming to pay the Shiva visit, to comfort the ovel, should not initiate the conversation, i.e. ad sheyipasach ha'ovel tchila, until the ovel talks first. And I've been to a Shiva, one of the very sad Shivas that I've been to. Sadly, that the couple had lost a child, a young child, and they were very crushed and very broken, and they would not, I think throughout the Shiva, they were not wanting to engage in conversation. It's, as we'll see, that really one should speak about the person who has passed away. And for a young baby, there isn't that much to say. And it was a totally silent Shiva. The parents were sitting Shiva, and all you heard was sort of footsteps of people coming in. A lot of people came in. And because of this halacha, that the ovel has to initiate the conversation, they were sort of simply looking down. They weren't really interested in conversing. And people came in. You just heard sort of the pitter-patter of footsteps. People sat down. And after a minute or two of silence, the menachamim, the people who came to visit, stood up and said, Hamokim menachem eschem. They walked out, and more people came in, and it was a silent shiva. That's what the Avelim wanted. They weren't wanting to initiate the conversation. And that really is based on this halacha. There is an exception that I've seen in the contemporary poskim, which says that if the person is an Adam Gadol, that a great person comes into a Shiva house, then sometimes the Avelim can be starstruck. And therefore, apparently the Chazon Ish and also Rav Yosef would initiate conversation as the Avelim were in awe and they were intimidated to talk. So that could be an exception to this rule, but generally speaking, the way you should wait for the Avelim to initiate conversation. And also then, really the conversation should be about the person who's passed away. I shouldn't be talking about random things, about the weather, about politics, about 1,000 things. Really about the person who's passed away, and therefore to open with conversations of tell me about your father, tell me about your mother, where were they born? These sort of conversations. I missed the Levaya. What did you muspid? What was said at the Hesped? What did you say? What are your happiest memories, etc., etc. I always felt that it's important to prepare beforehand some memories that you have of the person who's passed away, if that is applicable. And that's a source of a lot of comfort, or your relationship with that person, and something which will give chizuk to the Avelim. And actually I found this in the Shailas and Shuvas of the Shevet HaLevi. He quotes a Zohar, which says exactly that. If you look at the penultimate box on the first side, B'Zohar HaKodesh, mashma dekeidim shenichnas lanachim, tzarich lesade atzmei devarim, eich ubameh lanachim. Before you go in, you should think, stop for a few moments and just think, what can I say that will give a nechama, that will give some chizuk to the Avelim? And then, of course, when the visitor gets up to leave, you say the words Hamokum Yanachem Eschem B'Soch Shavei Yisirim Shalayim, and Sfaradim have a slightly different nusach, Min Hashemayim Yirachamu, I think it is, or Tanachamu, a very beautiful nusach, and that often is, some people get a little bit nervous. Many Shiva houses have a card behind the Avelim so that you can read the nusach. People do get nervous, but that is the minute to say it. My wife was once at a Shiva, and there's another person there. I think we've all experienced this, but as you stand up, it can be a very busy Shiva, very noisy, lots of people, And as you stand up to say the bracha, there's suddenly silence, and that makes the person a little bit more nervous. My wife was once there, and there was another person who stood up, and she was hoping to quietly just say the few, the sentence, and then walk out. But then it got silence, and all eyes turned to her, and she got even more nervous. And she looked at the Avelim and said, "V'chol b'nei Yisrael leyecharatz kelev l'shoinei," which of course is not the pasuk that she was hoping to say. It's the pasuk that one says apparently if you're, if there's a dog approaching you and you can calm it down. That's a scholar for that, maybe, I don't know. But either way, she fluffed her lines. But that's the minhag to say that pasuk in a slightly different nusach, or that sentence in a slightly different nusach in Sephardi circles. Now, if you turn over the page, what about Nichem Avelim on Shabbos? So the Aruch HaShulchan says that it's actually a machlekes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. The Beis Shammai say it's also Lenachem Avelim Avake Cholim b'Shabbos Mishum D'Mitzta'eh, because it causes you distress, and you shelo yovei lizek b'Shabbos, you shouldn't come to daven for the person. Beis Hillel Matzirin, but the Gemara says that's what the Rif says, by the way. Rashi says mitzvah, and the Rif says you might come to lizek to daven. Beis Hillel Matzirin, and Beis Hillel actually allow it. Mishum to bichlal gemilas chasodim, v'oid shemei klat sar mehem, and also it does help and alleviate their pain. However, one should avoid going, one shouldn't put off that visit. You should really go during the week. But are you allowed to pop into a Shiva house? So the Aruch HaShulchan says yes. But if you only you're busy working during the week, and therefore I plan it that I'm going to pop in on Shabbos, that's lo yofahem oisin, says the Aruch HaShulchan, quoting the Magen Avraham. Unless it's impossible to go, then you can pop in on Shabbos, but otherwise it's one should go during the week when the Shiva is operating, because the Shivas of course don't operate on Shabbos. And the Aruch HaShulchan says in the next Sif, in Sif Gimel, but our minhag is not to have a Shiva house at all on Shabbos, and that is of course the contemporary practice. But if you've got a very close relationship with the Avelim, there's no problem in you popping into their house and sitting with them. That is acceptable. But the Shiva will not operate as normal. Now, the very important aspect is, what is the purpose of Nichem Avelim? Why did Chazal institute it? Nichem Avelim pretty much is Drabonon. In fact, almost everything about Avelus is Drabonon. There is, of course, Aninus on the day of the Misa, which is Minat Torah. But aside from that, most of aspects of Hilchas Avelus is Midrabonon. And in fact, I once heard an amazing thing. A Rav in a very large shul, quite a secular shul in, I think it was in Australia, we once had a very interesting psak from Nosson Gestetner. Nosson Gestetner of the Lahoris Nosson fame of Bnei Brak once visited Australia, and the Rav told him that he's got a very large congregation, and many of them are quite distant from religion, but if one of them suffers a bereavement and they're sitting Shiva, it's a Shas HaKosher, it's an auspicious time to perhaps, encourage them to keep one aspect of Avelus. What aspect, which one halacha should they encourage them to do? And Rav Nosson Gestetner said something which I think most people would wouldn't instinctively think of. You would tell them maybe to say Kaddish, or to sit Shiva, or whatever it may be, to learn something, the Nishmosam. But Rav Nosson Gestetner told this Rav that the person who approaches him should be told that they should be very careful to make sure not to shave for the Shloshim, and at least for the whole Shiva. Why did he say that? What was the svara? Because for a guy who's sitting Shiva, and if he shaves, then he's not going to encounter the problem that sadly these secular people would have, namely shaving with a razor. And shaving with a razor is an Issa D'Oraisa, and if he could avoid that problem for a month, or at least for the Shiva, then that was saving them from many Isurim. Okay, now 2 aspects of Nichem Avelim. So it's very interesting. There's a famous tshuva of Rav Moshe whether or not Nichem Avelim can be done over the telephone. And of course by Zoom during the COVID years, sadly that was very common. But Rav Moshe says that there are 2 aspects of Nichem Avelim. One aspect of Nichem Avelim is for the mourner, to comfort the Ovel himself. The second aspect is for the mace, that it's somehow beneficial for the mace that people come to the place where he lived or where the Shiva is, and that is an Ilu Neshama for him. or her. So let's take a look. If you look in paragraph 6.1, the Gemara says in Moed Katan Chafala from the base, Maisu Meisu Bonosh Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva Nebuch lost children. Nichnusu Kol Yisrael ve'espidum hesped Godel. And Klal Yisrael came, the Godel Hadar is sitting Shiva as it were, and the whole of Klal Yisrael came to be maspid and to be menachem Rabbi Akiva. B'shas Petziros and Amad Rabbi Akiva al Safsel Godel. Rabbi Akiva, when Klal Yisrael were leaving, he stood up on a large bench, and he said, Achenu Beis Yisrael Shimu, my dear Yidden, my dear Klal Yisrael, please listen up. Afilu shnei bonim chasanim, even if the children that died were married and they had families, and the tragedy would be even worse because they'd left almonas with children and broken families, even if it would have been a worse tragedy, menuchim hu b'shvil kvod shasisim. I'm so grateful for the comfort that you have given me, that you've all come and given me a nechama, that I'm so grateful that even if the tragedy would have been worse, I would have been comforted. Go back to your houses, go back in peace. So you see that one aspect of Nichum Avelim is for the Ovel himself, is to get a nechama as personified by Rabbi Akiva in that situation. But in addition, there is also an aspect for the mace himself. What's the raya for that? So Ramesha brings a great raya from the Gemara in Shabbos Kufnan Beis Amud Aleph. This is in paragraph 6.2. The Gemara says there, Meis she'ein lo menachamim, if there is a person who passes away, and there are no mourners, there are no avelim, he didn't have children, there are no family members, whatever the case may be, what do you do? We're familiar with these situations where there just is no Shiva. So the Gemara says, 10 people go and they sit in the place where that person lived. And then the Gemara tells a story. There was a person who died in the neighborhood of Rabbi Yehuda, and he didn't have people comforting, there were no Avelim. The Kol Yoima the Dabar Yehuda Be'asar. Rabbi Yehuda took 10 people for Yossi Beduchte, and they sat there. Maybe they made the minyan there, or whatever it was. And after 7 days, the person who passed away appeared to Rabbi Yehuda in a dream. You should have peace of mind because you have settled my mind. And I've been involved in a situation like that, and it's quite common that we had a neighbor back, some years ago, a choshev person. He had actually learnt in Yeshivas Chachmei Lublin. His wife had predeceased him. He didn't have any children, and we gathered in his house and we davened. We made a minyan, and it was really based on this Gemara. The Rambam, interestingly, so you see there are two aspects of Nichum Avelim for the oval and for the person who had passed away. The Rambam says, Yirali, a very interesting thing. If you've got a choice, you've only got a window to do one or the other. To do Nichum Avelim or to do Bikuch Cholim, which one should you do? Says the Rambam, Nichum Avelim is greater than Bikuch Cholim because it's Gemilas Chesed im Achayim v'Mamesim. Because of this point, there are two aspects. It's like a double Gemilas Chasodim. You're doing it for the Chayim, i.e. the Avelim, and for the Mesim, and for those who have passed away. So in that respect, Nichum Avelim is greater. Now, what about Nichum Avelim over the telephone? So, Ramesha says, this is in box number 7, in Erchaim Chelik Dalet Siman Mem Ois Yud Aleph. He says this point that there are two aspects of Nichum Avelim. One is for the mourner, and one is for the person who's passed away. And therefore, the Rambam says, Mashmali, I'm looking at the second paragraph, or the last paragraph, telephone, and therefore the nafka mina would be Nichum Avelim over the telephone would be exactly this. If it's possible to do it over the telephone because that ultimately does comfort the mourner. It's not as great as going in person, but getting a call from someone on the telephone is serving that aspect, and it does give comfort to the mourner, to the ovel himself. But in the second aspect of doing it for the mace, the only aspect there of achieving something for the mace is in the place where they're sitting Shiva, or in the place where he dies, says Ramesha. And of course, it's much better to come in person, but doing it over the telephone is therefore better than nothing, because it's achieving nechama for the first aspect, i.e. for the oval. And therefore, and therefore, if it's possible to go in person where you're doing both aspects of Nichum Avelim, and the one for the oval is better, then for sure he should do that, and he should not exempt himself from just making a phone call. But nevertheless, there is certainly some aspect of the mitzvah which he's keeping by making a call or by visiting on Zoom if there's no option. If the person is sick, you can't travel, or he's preoccupied with the mitzvah, he should do whatever he can do, and if that means because there is an aspect of the mitzvah by making a call and by being menachem oval on the phone. And you shouldn't say, well, look, if I can't go in person, what's the point? No, there is a benefit to it, and he should at least do that. But of course, it's better to go in person. So there we have it. Different aspects of do's and don'ts of Nichum Avelim. The connection to the Sedra is that Sarah and Avram die, and the pasuk says, "Vayachri Mos Avram, Vayivarech Elokim es Yitzchak B'nai." Says Rashi, was Tanchumi Avelim. He was actually HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as it were, was making a Shiva visit to Yitzchak to comfort him. Is Nichum Avelim deraisa drabanan? Machlekes Rabbeinu Yonah and the Rambam, as we said, Rabbeinu Yonah says deraisa, the Rambam says drabanan. The Rambam famously has a slightly different nusach to the Brisa brought in Shabbos Kuf Chov Zayin Amud Aleph and what appears in our Siddur, and the discussion why that is the case. Do's and don'ts of a Shiva house. Number one, you wait for the oval to talk first. Unless, of course, a person is an Adam Gadol, Chazon Ish, Rabbi would actually initiate conversation, because often the oval we're in awe and we're intimidated to talk. And prepare what you say. Think of something, a connection you had, a memory, or something which will be menachem the person sitting Shiva. And the conversation should be about that and not about lots of other things. And of course, the minhag is to say Hamokim Menachem when you leave, and Min Hashemayim Tenachamu from in the Sephardi world. Nichum Avelim on Shabbos is not done, but if a person wants to pop into the Shiva house to speak to the Avelim, that's in order. But the regular Shiva doesn't conduct itself during Shabbos. And two aspects of Nichum Avelim, one is for the oval and one is for the mace. And the nafkamina would be Nichum Avelim over the telephone. It's better than nothing, because at least you're giving some nechama to the oval. But for the full, complete Nichum Avelim, preferably it should be done in person. And of course, there are other ways to be to give comfort to the person for the oval himself. One can do lots of things, and perhaps that's actually for another time. But that some of the do's and don'ts of Nichum Avelim. Hashem, we should be zocheh to have simchas and only happy occasions.